Well, for 60 days, the world was given a reason to believe that the US-Iran war might finally be moving towards an end. The guns were supposed to fall silent, the Strait of Hormuz was supposed to reopen, Iran was supposed to negotiate on the issue of uranium enrichment, while Washington was supposed to ease the economic pressure on Tehran and, most importantly, reduce its military presence around Iran. But now, that 60-day clock has run out, and the US-Iran MoU has expired, leaving the biggest issues that brought the two sides to the negotiation table unresolved. But here comes the question everyone is asking. With the MoU gone, is diplomacy dead and the war about to return? Well, the answer is very complicated and worrying at the same time. So come along as we understand what the latest trends suggest between the two sides and what happens in the next few hours, since the thread that was holding the trigger on the both sides has finally broken. The June 17 US-Iran Memorandum of Understanding was never designed as a detailed final peace treaty. It was more like a bridging gap between the two sides. And after months of fighting, Washington and Tehran agreed an immediate and permanent termination of military operations and gave themselves 60 days to work towards a broader settlement. The framework could also be extended if both sides agreed. Now remember, this MoU attempted to tackle several explosive issues at once. Washington was expected to end its naval blockade of Iran, ease sanctions, provide waivers for Iranian oil exports, and give Tehran access to frozen assets. Well, most importantly, it also committed a reconstruction and development package worth at least $300 billion. On the flip side, Iran was expected to clear mines from the Strait of Hormuz and allow commercial vessels to pass without charges for at least 60 days period. Tehran also reaffirmed that it would not pursue nuclear weapons and agreed to negotiate the much harder question of uranium enrichment. Well, on paper, this was a remarkable opening, but the problem was very simple. The agreement was too broad, while the disagreements were extremely specific, and now that gap seems to have eventually destroyed it. Within weeks, Washington and Tehran were accusing each other of breaking this deal. The US argued that Iran had failed to honor its commitment, particularly over the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran told a completely different story. Tehran accused Washington of continuing military pressure, failing to lift sanctions, failing to release Iranian assets, and failing to end the naval blockade as promised. By July 7th, Trump declared that, in his view, the agreement was already over. In fact, Iran subsequently said it had suspended its own commitments because Washington had violated the agreement itself. Well, all these developments were simply not a diplomatic misunderstanding. It was a problem of sequencing and, most importantly, trust. Washington wanted Iran to take concrete steps first. Tehran wanted the US to demonstrate that the sanctions relief, the end of the naval blockade, and the economic concessions were actually coming. Well, it seems neither side wanted to give away its strongest bargaining chip before receiving something in return. And then came the issue that could potentially derail everything achieved: the Strait of Hormuz. Well, for Iran, Hormuz became a strategic bargaining weapon, and for the United States, leaving the world's most crucial energy choke points effectively under Iranian control was absolutely unacceptable. Iranian officials insisted that the strait could be opened or closed under Iranian command. Trump, meanwhile, threatened an even more dramatic response, suggesting that Washington could assert control over Hormuz. Well, this exchange transformed Hormuz from a shipping issue into a question of national sovereignty and military power. The MoU has survived on paper, but politically, it was already breaking apart. Now, the expiry of the agreement does not remove the original problems. It makes them even more dangerous. First and the biggest, the Strait of Hormuz. Commercial shipping through the strait has fallen sharply, with only a handful of commodity vessels crossing during the recent weekend. Iran has also been discussing possible shipping arrangements with Oman, but Tehran has linked any wider reopening to a broader political understanding with Washington itself. So the question is no longer simply whether ships can actually pass, it is about who actually controls the passage. Now, second is Iran's nuclear program. Remember, June MoU did not settle the Iran nuclear issue. Iran affirmed that it would not pursue nuclear weapon, but the most contentious question, which is uranium enrichment, was left for negotiations on a final agreement. Well, that means one of the most dangerous questions in this entire conflict remains open. How much uranium can Iran enrich? At what levels? What inspections will be allowed? What happens to Iran's nuclear infrastructure? And what guarantees will prevent another war if negotiation fails? Third comes sanctions and frozen Iranian assets. Iran wants economic relief. Washington wants leverage. In fact, the US has already indicated that additional economic pressure could follow the collapse of this very framework, including measures targeting Iran's oil exports further and financial networks. Fourth, and perhaps the most important, the US military presence. Iran wants restriction on American military power around its territory. Washington, meanwhile, wants the freedom to maintain enough military capabilities to deter Tehran and protect shipping. All these issues taken together raises another important question. Can either side trust the other enough to sign another agreement? In our understanding, it achieved very little. It failed to produce a final peace agreement, it failed to resolve Hormuz issue, it failed to settle the nuclear question, it failed to produce a durable agreement on sanctions and economic relief. But also it would be wrong to say the MoU achieved nothing. It created a diplomatic channel at a moment when the alternative was continued military confrontation. It demonstrated that Washington and Tehran could still communicate indirectly, at least through the mediators. It also temporarily created exceptions of de-escalation. Oil markets reacted positively when the June agreement was actually announced, with crude prices falling sharply as fears of prolonged disruption eased. In fact, the most important part is that this MoU established a possible template for what a future agreement could look like. The problem is that the trust required to implement it never developed. So perhaps the June agreement did not end the war, but it proved that diplomacy was still possible, even if only for a short period of time, and that may become a crucial point now. Now, the expiry of the MoU does not automatically mean that US and Iran will immediately return to a full-scale war. The framework has expired, but diplomatic communication have not completely disappeared. Qatar, Pakistan and Oman are still involved in carrying messages between Washington and Tehran. In fact, Iran has also been discussing shipping arrangements with Oman. So what comes next could be something neither side wants to call a new peace deal. It could begin with a smaller arrangement, perhaps a shipping arrangement for Hormuz, perhaps a limited sanctions concession, perhaps an agreement on frozen Iranian assets, or perhaps a new nuclear negotiation framework. But remember, the danger is that every one of these steps could also fail. Washington is already signaling greater pressure, and Iran appears unwilling to return to the June formula. So now the post-August 17 scenario is unlikely to be a simple choice between peace and war. But there is a third possibility: pressure, threats, indirect talks, and limited confrontation, as we have seen till now, or all happening at the same time. But there is also a dangerous fourth possibility. If Hormuz remains restricted, if US sanctions intensify, if Iran refuses concession on its nuclear program, and most importantly, if military incidents increase, the diplomatic space could disappear rapidly or completely. And then the question would no longer be whether the June MoU failed, it would be whether the failure of that agreement becomes the next trigger for the next phase of the US-Iran war. Well, with that, it's a wrap on today's edition of From the News Desk. Thank you so much for watching, and I'm Yash Goyal signing off for Times Now Digital. Until next time, take care and keep watching this space for more such videos.